Regulatory agencies are set up to try and manage risk in our economy and to our consumers. How do they do this? Well, they determine what an acceptable level of risk is. And what does that mean? It's the highest probability of the bad outcomes that can occur and still allow your product to go to market. If the probability of these bad outcomes is lower than that probability, then you're able to market this good, and you're able to get your profit from selling it, and the consumers can benefit by consuming it, although at some risk, what's considered an acceptable risk. If the probability of those bad outcomes is higher than the threshold probability, then you're not allowed to market your good, and you don't make that profit, and the consumers don't benefit. But of course, they avoid that risk, which is considered unacceptable. The problem with this approach is that it creates a single standard for what is acceptable risk to govern everyone. Why is that a problem? Well, some people are willing to try apparently very risky things. For example, skydiving, while others aren't willing to do even very mundane things that aren't particularly risky, like flying on an airplane. Individuals have very different tolerances for risk that they derive out of their own preferences for those particular experiences. Preferences are diverse. They're not the same for everybody, and thus risk tolerance is also very diverse. How do we determine this risk tolerance? Remember, we defined how risky something was in terms of the probabilities of the outcomes and the actual outcomes themselves. The key is that the outcomes mean very different things to different people. One person may consider flying not particularly worth the risk, while another believes it is. Why would this happen? Well, why is the person deciding to fly? Is it for business? Is it for pleasure? Is it they're visiting their aunt? Those may have very different meanings to different people and very different values. As well, what's the alternative? Could I take the train? Could I drive there very easily or not? And what's the cost involved? All of these different motives mean I might have a very different risk tolerance for flying than you might have. Let's go over a numerical example. Let's take skydiving. Skydiving kills about 1 in every 100,000 people who decides to jump. That means the probability of jumping and landing safely is something very close to 1, 0.99999. The probability of jumping to your doom is the remaining probability, 0.00001. Even if all of us could agree on these numbers, the probability of death versus the probability of safely landing, we might still have very different willingness to jump or to avoid jumping. Consider Jan. Jan loves the thrill of falling thousands of feet through the air with the wind in her hair. In fact, we could measure her pleasure in a bunch of different ways. One very simple way is just to measure it by how much she's willing to pay for that experience. Suppose she's willing to pay $10,000 to experience that fall, irrespective of anything else. Although falling presents this other risk of potentially dying. And suppose the pain of death would be something rather unpleasant. In fact, suppose that it would be equivalent to losing $3 million. In other words, she'd be willing to pay $3 million, which may be all she has access to, in order to avoid it. Then, on average, when she goes skydiving, she's realizing the probability of a safe land times her value of that safe landing, plus the probability of dying times the value of dying. And in this case, it would work out to something pretty close to $10,000. And so if her opportunity cost, in other words, what she could do otherwise, is worth $0, she should go jump. Alternatively, consider Lisa, who is uncomfortable with the thought of falling, that it's something sort of painful to her to even think about. She's more of a homebody. She doesn't like thrills. She would rather sit on her couch in her home. For her, that feeling of falling would be equivalent to losing $500. She'd be willing to pay $500 to avoid that feeling. Again, she may be may consider death to be something that's unpleasant, but maybe not quite as unpleasant as what Jan thought. For Lisa, it's something she'd be willing to pay $20,000 to avoid. So she doesn't particularly fear death. Again, how do we calculate the value to this individual? It's the probability of a safe landing times the value of that safe landing plus the probability of falling to her doom times the value of dying, which in this case is equivalent to losing about $500. So if the alternative, sitting on her couch, is worth about zero to her, she shouldn't jump. So what does this mean for GMOs? Risk tolerance for GMOs could depend on the perceived benefits and the perceived risks. For farmers, they may be considering some of the risk they face in stewardship of their land, but they're also considering the impact on profits and on what it means to their family if they can grow using this new technology. Consumers will evaluate their value of this risk of GMOs based on the possibility of cheaper food and the potential health risks. If there are GMOs that are developed to address some specific consumer needs, then they might consider those benefits as well. Firms selling the GMOs are going to consider the profits that they can make, as well as any sort of legal liabilities they might face. The problem, though, is the regulator must decide on only one standard to determine if that GMO can be marketed or not.